Hello, my little Luxxes. This is another episode of Ghost Stories My Father Used to Tell Me, and I am your host, cosplayer Charsie Luxxx. And we're gonna do a little bit of a title change to Ghost Stories My Father Used to Tell Me. If you couldn't tell by the intro of this episode, we're shortening it just a little bit, just a little bit. So it is now going to be Ghost Stories My Father Told Me. So just something where, I don't mind the long title or anything like that, but we can sum it down a little bit more. So we are now a part of Ghost Stories My Father Told Me. And this is also going more on theme with January. I almost said July. As much as I wish it was July right now, it is January. So for January's theme of Frost Bites Back. So I am in my winter witch again, but this should also seem familiar because this is my ski resort clothing that I wore for the movie review of Frozen. I'm going to be dying in this with the hood up like this, so I'm probably going to take this hood down just so I don't die of heat stroke in the middle of this, because like I said in the previous one, I am in a warm, heated house, so me being in layers like this, I am very warm. So being in a wig and a hat and a faux fur, this is actually my Princess Mononoke hoodie thing from Hot Topic, not sponsored in any way or form, but this thing is warm. Anyway, more back on topic of what today's ghost story is about. So as I had said before, that my dad never had a winter episode. My dad never really had a ghost story where he told a snow-related story. He did have a corn yeti one, which, I guess I could turn that into a snow yeti instead of a corn yeti, but that one was always funny because obviously here in northern Illinois, where I had grown up in my hometown, it was surrounded by cornfields, soybean fields, so my dad would have a lot of fun scaring the crap out of us with his snow yeti stories. With his corn yeti stories. So, but anyway, we're not going for that type of a story today, even though I kind of look like I'm dressed like the abominable snowman. But what we are going to do is I'm going to do my typical, where I'm just going to come up with a ghost story of my own. And this one might eventually start sounding familiar because I'm going to base it off of a television series, or at least an episode of one of these television series, and you should be able to figure it out pretty quickly which one I am talking about, which one I am basing it off of. So we will begin my tale by talking about frostbite. It is a very cold, blistering day in January up in the Alaskan tundra. The location is only a few miles away from Nome, Alaska, where a small research team has been doing geology tests and has been drilling into the core, or I should at least say the permafrost, and the ground, where they have been taking core samples, as you would want to call them, and testing them. There are 3 people a part of this research team. You have Alyssa, and you have Cody, and you have Bert. And they've all been working several months with these core samples, and they just recently were able to celebrate because in this last drilling that they had done, they had reached farther below the Earth's core than anyone else has on record. In a big congratulations and celebration for their great discovery of drilling down farther than anybody else has, that they were celebrating with some champagne, and didn't notice that some of their core samples that, while they were sitting out on a table and were thawing, they didn't realize that something very strange was happening to these cold ice samples that they had, and that it technically also was dirt and mud, but since it was so far below, that it just was frozen for how many years? Centuries, probably. But they didn't know this while they had these core samples sitting out, that they were starting to thaw. And they weren't thinking anything of it since they were celebrating with some champagne. While the researchers did not realize what was happening, some strange creature started moving and wriggling. Something very worm-like looking was coming out of this now thawing core sample that they had. These researchers who are celebrating don't realize what is going on, and that one of these worm-like creatures managed to crawl its way into Cody's drink. So while this worm is in Cody's drink and he's not noticing what had happened, takes a long drink of his champagne, and this worm dives into his body. And this parasitic worm wiggled its way until it found its way to his brain and was able to use his fear sensories to gain control of Cody. That unfortunately, while Cody was under the influence of this parasite, not knowing what was going on, managed to kill the other two researchers. And unfortunately, after he killed the two other researchers, he killed himself as well. Everybody trying to find out weeks later what had happened to this research team. And now you have a couple of FBI agents and another couple of researchers all going up to do an investigation to find out what happened with this team. So they get up there, and of course they are checking recordings that were journals kind of explaining what had happened, and they were also at the morgue looking at the bodies and not realizing what had happened completely, just trying to do a research and investigation to find out themselves. Through their research, they found that, of course, that they had drilled down farther than anybody ever had before, and that they had found this great discovery, and that Cody, who was talking in the live journal, because they would do recordings for their journals, and was celebrating because they had found in this core that there was a worm-like creature, that there was something in here that would prove that there was life how many centuries ago. And in their excitement, of course, they had celebrated, and they could see from the research team that they had left these cores out. But since then, the cores had been placed back into the freezers where they were kept cool. So obviously, the new research team, wanting to find out what had happened, wanted to look at these cores and find what this research team had found. So the two FBI agents, who are also extremely curious about the circumstances, what had happened, were going along with the two researchers and wanting to learn and investigate. And the one FBI agent, she was a scientist herself, and she was extremely curious to know exactly what was in this core that they had found. The female FBI agent was joining the two researchers in obviously checking out these cores. They were examining them, looking at them. They come to find out that sure enough, inside these cores was some kind of a living organism, and not realizing that this living organism that this research team from before had found was actually a parasite. Obviously, in them doing their own research, once again, these cores that were brought back out are now thawing, and these prehistoric parasitic worms that are inside of them are now being released. And of course, this team doesn't think anything of it due to the fact that these worms are centuries years old. There's no reason why they should be able to thaw and be alive again. One of these worms manages to get out and goes to find its way into another host. While it found its new host, also realized that it needed to take the other parasites and try and infect the rest of the team with it. Researcher who had the parasite inside of them now had went and killed the helicopter driver who had gone with them. Obviously they weren't a part of the team, but they were there because that was their only pilot that they had and their only source to get up there. Then when the team realizes that the pilot had been murdered by someone, they clearly wanted to call for more help and they needed another flight to evacuate. But unfortunately, there was a storm that was going through. So now the FBI agents and the researchers were trapped in this research development building. Someone among them is a killer, but they don't know why, they don't know who. Well, through their research and continuous, especially for the female FBI agent, she started to realize that these worms were still alive and that as they thawed, they started to move from their pupal state. Obviously, they can make it into somebody's brain and take over. And she started to realize that when it takes over the part of the brain, it took over the part that focuses on fear and on anger. And that's how it used its hormones to control the person, to make them kill because of fear and anger. The female FBI agent and the male researcher are working together, and they discover that by complete accident, that when two of the parasitic worms were spilled together, that they behaved much like the Chinese fighting fish, and that they would attack each other until they literally killed each other. So in this development, they realized they could use this to their advantage and that they could use one of these parasitic worms to find the person who was already infected, and they could possibly get this person to be safe and get rid of this parasitic worm from it by adding another one. But the problem was figuring out who was the one that was indeed infected with this parasitic worm in the first place. They couldn't prove who had been the murderer in the first place. Obviously, through fear and anger and everything else that was going on in the situation, they were all pointing fingers at each other. The one who was actually infected with the parasitic worm, who was the female researcher, had decided that she would put the focus on the male FBI agent and had said that he was the one infected. So obviously she was trying to push them to add the worm to his ear so that he would be able to get rid of the other parasite with another one. But of course, the male FBI agent kept trying to explain to everyone, if you put this worm in my ear, all you're doing is infecting me because I'm not infected, it's not me. The male FBI agent, of course, had his own conversations with the female FBI agent that he had worked with previously, trying to explain to her, like, you can't do this to me because if you put this parasite in my ear, I will essentially be infected as well. We need to find the right person. Well, unfortunately, the female researcher is able to talk her co-worker, the other researcher, into being on her side and thinking that the male FBI agent was the one who was doing this. They decide to tie up the female FBI agent while she's in the process of trying to explain to him that her partner wasn't infected. So they tie her up and decide that they're going to force this parasitic worm into the male FBI agent. But just on the last whim, just before they are about to add this parasitic worm to his ear, the male researcher realizes that he can see something strange wiggling in the back of his co-worker's neck, that he can see something worm-like and strange just wiggling at the back of her neck. Him realizing exactly what was going on and that she was trying to do this to infect another person with the worm is when he knocks out his co-worker, and then him and the FBI agent, the one that they were going to infect with a worm, and add another parasitic worm to her ear. And then that way, the two parasitic worms were at battle and at odds with each other, that their hormones counteract each other, and literally they will kill each other in that moment, just like a betta fish would. FBI agents were able to figure out that this is what was going on, that this worm that the research team had found before was very, very deadly, very dangerous. But obviously they wanted to let it out into the world to let them know that this thing was there. But before they could release any of their evidence to anyone, somebody mysteriously decided to burn down the building and all the evidence and all the research with it. Both the research team and the FBI agents were never able to tell a soul what was going on, and anyone that they did tell what had happened, nobody would believe them because there was no evidence. Well, I hope that story sounded very, very, very familiar, because I've kind of hinted at it before, but that was just a quick spin-off ghost story inspired by the X-Files episode Ice. So it surely seemed very, very familiar, especially if you have recently seen that episode. And like I said, very, very loosely based off of it. So it's been a while since I've watched that episode. I especially need to rewatch the first season of the X-Files. It's one of my favorite shows. It's just one of those that if you need a good comfort binge show on, it is definitely one of those. And as I've said before, Ice is one of my favorite episodes. And we will put the hood back up for the outro of this. And I just kind of wanted to do a quick little ghost story episode for this one. And I'm sorry I didn't come up with my own better story. This one I just kind of did on a whim, where I'm like, I can just talk about the X-Files episode Ice. So yeah, this could be a little TV special of favorite episodes and just kind of lump them into being ghost stories. But I guess I should also say this is the official last episode of Frostbite's Back, and that next month, for the theme of February, we are doing the theme that is inspired by my friend Mikey, or Michael. You would probably prefer Michael. I'm one of the special few that gets the honor of calling him Mikey. But shout out to you, and you helped me to come up with the theme for February, which is Love Hurts. But quite obviously, for February's theme of Love Hurts, we are going to focus on Valentine's themed horror films or thrillers, most likely horror films, because that's what I like to focus on, because that is my favorite genre to talk about and to watch. I'm sure My Bloody Valentine will be in there, Valentine may be in there. I'm also going to go through Bad Brittany about a year ago. Actually, it would have been a year ago. She did a Valentine's themed horror movie review talking about different Valentine's themed ones, and there was one in there that she had talked about that I had never seen, and I need to go back and rewatch that episode on her YouTube channel and find which one it was, because obviously I'm going to do a nice shout out to Brittany about it, and I am very interested to watch that movie and to review it myself. If I can do a commentary, I will. Like I said, it's been kind of interesting trying to figure out reaction videos and dealing with copyright claims off and on, but we shall see. Moving forward, we will stay on the positive side of things. But as always, thank you so much for joining me here on another Ghost Stories My Father Told Me. And once again, we'll come up with more ghost stories as we go along. I'll do a little more research and things like that for the future. But thank you for joining me. And if you would care to follow me on my other social medias, you can follow me on my Twitter for Charsie Luxxx with 3 X's, or on my Instagram for Charsie87. And no matter what time of the day it is, I hope you have a Luxxxy Charms kind of day. Bye! Hello, my little Luxxes. This is another episode of Luxxxy Charms. Although this should be familiar because this was my ski resort where there is a small research team that has been working at driving what this research is. And then him in the mail, and then so nobody was able to let it. So